This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to replace these 15 cards with these 15 cards in our Lord Windgrace EDH deck, and I'm going to tell you the reasons why. Thank you for joining us for another installment of the Up and Up series. Today we are going to update and upgrade Lord Windgrace as it takes one step closer to entering into the Burgeoning Commander Catalog. Today we are going to turn over roughly 1/6 of the deck, and after doing so we are seriously going to upgrade the power level of this Jund Lands Matter Commander deck. So let's get started right away with the first card making its way into this deck. It is Spitfire Lagak, with lands being such an important feature to this build, Landfall that is, as finding as many different ways to utilize the lands coming into play, this one dealing direct damage to our opponents. We could look at Spitfire Lagak and cards like it as win conditions in this build. Whenever a land comes into play under our control, this lizard is going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. Spitfire Lagak's absence from the deck previous is unknown at this time, but Spitfire Lagak is finding its way now, and it is now part of the 99. With this mono-red lizard going in, it's going to replace Phylath World Sculptor. Now, yes, this is a Lands Matter deck, so yes, there are more lands in this build than in usual or general EDH builds. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a great number of basic lands in this deck, and that's where Phylath World Sculptor shines. Its ability to come into play to create 0/1 green plant creature tokens only happens for basic lands we control. This is A of Z, Avenger of Zendikar. This is A of Z Light, and in this build, Spitfire Lagak is going to do more work for us than Phylath could. So Phylath is out, and the Spitfire Lagak is in. Card number 2 finding its way in, it is Dryad of the Elysian Grove. Here we are able to play an additional land during our turns, and lands we control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. Now, admittedly, in this deck, color fixing was never a problem. We're only 3 colors. We have a ton of ramp, so we were never missing those key colors in order to cast any of the spells in our deck. However, that additional land drop is going to come into play mighty wonderfully in this kind of build. This card's absence from the deck previous was just more about availability than anything else. We didn't have a copy of Dryad floating around at the time of this deck's construction. 1 became available, and now it has to force its way into the 99 of this deck. With the Dryad going in, it's going to replace Agadeem's Awakening. Now here we have one of those cards that is a 2-face card, so it's an MFDC. We got a sorcery on the front that allows us to return from our graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creature cards that each have a different converted mana cost of X or less. The spell itself is X and 3 black. On the flip side of this card is a land. It comes into play tapped unless we pay 3 life. So what we in effect are doing is we're taking out a potential land source and putting Dryad of the Elysian Grove in, which will help us to get more lands onto the battlefield through a round of turns in any given game. As an additional detriment for this card being in this deck, this is not a creature-heavy deck. We have lots of ways to create creature tokens from some of the creatures that are in the 99, but Agadeem's Awakening is kind of wasted in this kind of deck because we are not running a creature-heavy deck. This is more about the lands doing all the heavy lifting, with the small number of creatures giving us peripheral benefits to the lands coming into play. So it's easier to take out Agadeem's Awakening because of what Dryad of Elysian Grove can do for us over the course of the game. Card number 3 going in is Ren and Realmbreaker. This card is going to do so much work in this deck, not necessarily for its static ability, but all of its other abilities are extraordinarily relevant in this build. Its static ability is pretty much one part of Dryad of the Elysian Grove. Lands we control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. It's basically the same thing, just worded a little differently. So his their +1 ability, Rem and Realmbreaker, up to 1 target land we we control becomes a 3/3 elemental creature with vigilance, hexproof, and haste until our next turn, it's still a land. So there is a slight chance, sorcery speed mass removal could end up costing us one of our lands, but the hexproof does prevent any spot removal spells or abilities from our opponents, so I guess that kind of hedges against each other, something that we're going to have to look for with further gameplay experience with this card in the 99. For -2 loyalty counters, we can mill 3 cards, and we may put a permanent card from among the mill cards into our hand. More often than not, with the high number of lands based on the ratio of this build, we should very easily get a land card at least to bring to our hand for the purposes of triggering all of our various landfall abilities. And then lastly, if we can get to at least 7 loyalty counters on Wrenn and Whelmbreaker, we can take off 7, and then we get an emblem with we may play lands and cast permanent spells from our graveyard. A lot of the landfall comes from our graveyard because we do have included in here cards like Crucible of Worlds, Ramunap Excavator. We have a lot of ways to get cards from our graveyard back onto the battlefield, and Wrenn and Whelmbreaker's emblem helps us to do that and more. So that card, a newer addition going into the 99 of this build. It is going to replace Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. Now, some of the reasons why we took out Agadeem's Awakening are going to apply to Ashaya. We're going to skip down to the second block of text for Ashaya here, saying non-token creatures we control are forest lands in addition to their other types. Well, we don't have, again, a ton of creatures in this deck, and Ashaya itself doesn't have any kind of evasion, and even though its power and toughness will be astronomically high because it's equal to the number of lands we control, without that evasion or even, reach or vigilance or just something to help it to be a little more powerful, Ashaya is just not as good as she could be in this type of Lord Windgrace build. And it is my theory that Wrenn and Whelmbreaker, they are going to do a lot more work in this deck than Ashaya ever could. So that actually was as easy as a transition as putting the Dryad in for Agadeem's Awakening. Card number 4 going in is Druid Class. All right, here we have level 1. Whenever a land comes into play under our control, we gain 1 life. That's going to be a lot of life gained in this type of build. If we pay 2 and a green to level up to level 2, we get to play an additional land on each of our turns. So again, we have another Dryad of Elysian Grove effect by giving us an additional land drop during our turns. And remember, as stated previously, I'm not sure earlier is a word or whatever. So as we stated previously, we can play land cards from our graveyard thanks to cards like Crucible of Worlds and Ramunap Excavator, and potentially the emblem from Wrenn and Whelmbreaker. So being able to play, say a Fabled Passage or a Prismatic Vista or a fetch land from our graveyard helps to get more lands from our library into play, getting even more landfall triggers. And if we pay 4 and a green to get to level 3 of this class, then this gives target land we control becomes a creature with haste, and the creature's power and toughness are each equal to the lands we control, and it's still a land. So although that's not as big of a bump up as we can possibly do, because again, the land is still just a big vanilla creature, and it would be susceptible to creature removal, more often than not, we're going to keep this at level 2 to gain that life and to have an additional land drop. So Druid Class is going in, and it's going to replace Tectonic Reformation. Now, this was an enchantment that was in here as a way in which to get land cards into our graveyard for the purposes of being able to play them from our graveyard with some of the aforementioned cards that we were just talking about. This gives each land card in our hands cycling for 1 red mana, and it too could cycle. Well, it just seemed that with it being in a 3-color deck, even though we do have ways in which to fix the mana, and as I said earlier in the video, we would never have any difficulty in casting our spells. It just seems like Tectonic Reformation is one of those cards that I personally want it to be better than I think it actually is. And I really thought it would synergize a lot more in this deck. but its results always leave me wanting a little bit more. So from one enchantment to another, for Druid class going in with the same mana value as Tectonic Reformation, I think overall the life gain and the additional land drop will prove to be a much more valuable addition than losing the cycling ability of each land that Tectonic Reformation provided. We're going to see that during gameplay and experience, so we shall see. All right, next up is change number 5 going in is Augur of Autumn. We may look at the top card of our library at any time, and we may play lands from the top of our library. So a lot of what we talked about so far in this deck has been playing some lands from the graveyard. By putting in Augur of Autumn, she helps us to give another outlet of playing lands, and that comes from the top of our library. She also has an additional ability with respect to the Coven mechanic, and as long as we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, we may cast creature spells from the top of our library. That should not be a problem in this deck because of how many ways in which we can create creature tokens, so we should be able to play lands and cast spells from the top of our library pretty regularly with Augur of Autumn on our side of the battlefield. Having access to the top of our library for those land cards is going to be huge in a deck that wants to get lands onto the battlefield from everywhere. So with Augur of Autumn going in, it's going to replace a removal spell called Hagra Mauling. So here we had another MFDC, multi-faced double card. It's an MFDC, I think that's how it goes. We have a card here with 2 different sides. Here we have Hagra Mauling as an instant for 2 and 2 black, although it costs 1 less to cast if an opponent controls no basic lands. It just simply destroys target creature. So for either a total CMC of 3 or 4, we destroy target creature. And then on the back side of this is a land that comes into play tapped. I believe it comes into play tapped without any way in which for it to be untapped. Yeah, it comes into play tapped, gives us a black mana. So similar to what we said about Agadeem's Awakening, we're taking out a land source for the purposes of adding another card that helps us to get more lands onto the battlefield. The thought process here is, for a removal spell standpoint, this is not very strong. And the land coming into play tapped, yes, it's a land, it'll trigger our landfall abilities, but I believe that Augur of Autumn's ability to let us play lands from the top of our library is going to be much more valuable throughout the game than the one-time effect that the backside of Hagra Mauling gives us. And plus, all we're losing besides the land coming into play tapped, which would trigger our landfall abilities, is an overcosted destroy target creature spell. So I think that's a pretty reasonable exchange to make with the Augur going in and Hagra Mauling coming out. Listen, we're also in Jund colors, so we have no shortage of very effective and efficient removal spells, and Hagra Mauling is not one of those. Next card going in, we have Chaos Warp. There's a nice effective removal spell. Its absence from this deck was just based upon availability. Now that a copy has resurfaced, it's going into the 99 of this build. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. I think every Magic player that's ever sat down to a game with a Chaos Warp or 2 has a Chaos Warp story. I'd love to hear yours in the comments section below. Note that Chaos Warp takes care of any permanents in play. Lands, artifacts, enchantments, creatures, planeswalkers. Any of those permanents are taken care of with Chaos Warp. That's going in, and it's going to replace Putrefy. For the same mana value, 3 versus 3, we have an instance that can take care of any permanent, where here Putrefy destroys target creature or artifact. It cannot be regenerated. In a vacuum, Chaos Warp is most likely going to be the better card, but again, that all depends on what permanent is revealed from the top of the library, and I want to hear about your most memorable Chaos Warp story in the comment section below. Again, overall, I think Chaos Warp will be a better overall removal spell than Putrefy. Next card going in is Decimate, the ultimate 1 for 4. That's right, folks. 1 for 4. 2 in Gruul colors. We destroy target artifact, target creature, target enchantment, and target land. We're going to get the biggest bang for our buck here, 1 permanent destroyed for each 1 mana we spend. Yes, we must have a legal target for each one of these cards when we cast the spell, but if for some reason one of those targets happens to disappear or no longer be a legal target, the other targets will still be destroyed. Decimate is going to get rid of 4 permanents for the cost of 4 mana and just 1 card from our hand. Decimate's going in, and it's going to replace Death Sprout. Again, same mana value of 4, but Death Sprout only destroys target creature, and then we search our library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. We're not going to miss this removal spell, the instant versus sorcery. I mean, there is definitely some room for discussion there. Instant speed is almost always better than sorcery speed, of course. However, we're holding up 4 total mana to just destroy target creature. This is Hagra Mauling all over again, with the absence of the rampant growth effect. So, in a vacuum, and specifically for the purposes of upgrading and updating this deck, Decimate is better than Death Sprout. So we have no trouble making that exchange either. All right, we're getting closer and closer to the end here. The next card going in. Oh, speaking of the ultimate 1 card to destroy so many, we have Casualties of War. Sorcery for 2, 2 black, 2 green. We can choose 1 or more of the following modes. Destroy target artifact, destroy target creature, destroy target enchantment, destroy target land, destroy target planeswalker. Now, this is a little more costed than Decimate. For Decimate, it's 4 for 4. Here with Casualties of War, the best we can do is 6 for 5. That's 6 mana for 5 total permanents. And even though one of those has to be a Planeswalker, and generally Planeswalkers are a little sparse in our format, still I think it's definitely worth including. The 6 mana on our turn for the sorcery speed spell should not be a problem, because this is a Jund ramp landfall deck. We will not have any trouble having the mana to cast this spell, and then some during our turn. So Casualties of War is going in, and it's going to replace Pernicious Deed. Now here we had a global board wipe effect on an enchantment for 1 in Golgari colors. We would pay X and sacrifice this to destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with converted mana cost X. Yes, this definitely has some very, very powerful removal effect on it. The only problem with it is that it affects us just as much as it affects our opponents. Our game plan is pretty much tied around our powerful artifacts and enchantments, in addition to our creatures and creature tokens. Those are going to be our primary paths to victory, and Pernicious Deed was included in this build as a way in which to act as a global board wipe, as a just-in-case scenario. I would rather be a little less reactive and a little more proactive, which is why I think Casualties of War could do a better job of getting rid of the troublesome permanents on the battlefield, as opposed to just jamming mana into Pernicious Deed and watching everything just burn down to the ground. That sets us back so much, because we would lose a lot of our cheaply costed artifacts and enchantments, not to mention all of our artifact tokens. So for the overall mana comparison, the 6 mana that we jam into Casualties of War to pick off precise problem permanents most likely is going to be less than the overall mana spent to cast Pernicious Deed and to jam the X into it, and we end up not losing any of our permanents by using Casualties of War over Pernicious Deed. All right, next card going in. Oh, I kind of spoiled it there a little bit. Well, we might as well just put them up at the same time. They both do exactly the same thing. We have Nature's Lore and 3 Visits. Here we have 2 sorcery speed ramp spells, 1 in a green mana, that we get to search our library for a forest card and put that bad boy onto the battlefield. Note that it says forest card, which does not necessarily mean that it has to be a basic forest. We can look for those shock lands that have forest in their land types, as well as some of the other cards that do the same. So those 2 babies are going in, Nature's Lore and 3 Visits. Those 2 spells are going in and are going to replace Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. Now, this may be a bit of a controversial choice, but hear me out here for a moment before you start sharpening your pitchforks and lighting your torches. Cultivate and Kodama's Reach are identical spells with an overall CMC of 3. So we are paying 3 mana to get 1 land into play and 1 land into our hand. For each of the 2 previous spells, Nature's Lore and 3 Visits, and the lands can only be basics. The Nature's Lore and the 3 Visits, they're in there to specifically get a forest card, not necessarily being a basic. That's 2 mana per 1 card. Here, we get 1.5 mana per 1 card, but the card goes into play tapped, and then the other one goes into our hand. Additionally, as more and more options become available with respect to diversifying the land base of this deck, the number of basic lands continues to drop, as you'll see later in this video. We're soon going to get to the point where the number of basic lands in this build are going to be so sparse that having spells like Cultivate and Kodama's Reach in our hand during the mid to late game will end up producing no lands on our side of the battlefield or in our hand. So forward thinking, these 2 spells at some point in this build are going to become obsolete, where cards like Nature's Lore and 3 Visits will have many more options available. Those are the reasons why those 2 single land spells are going in, and they're going to replace 2 of the most popular and iconic green ramp spells that we have in the format. All right, we're just about done here. The next card going in, we're up to our land parts. All right, so let's just do this all in one shot here with our lands. Okay, so we got some lands going in to take the place of other lands, as we have foreshadowed earlier. Going in is Reflecting Pool. Now, yes, this is one of those lands. It's not going to be sought out by Nature's Lore or 3 Visits, Cultivate, or Kodama's Reach, of course. However, it's going to help to fix our mana because, let's face it, this bad boy is going to act as Command Tower version 2.0, and that is the best land in our format. Also going in is Prismatic Vista. This is going to help to find those basic lands, which we can reuse over and over again from our graveyard. Note that this is 1 land per activation and 1 life, not similar to what we have with Kodama's Reach and Cultivate. That's going to flush out 2 lands per each time we cast it, while Prismatic Vista is going to act as our basic land fetch land. That will help us to activate our landfall abilities, and also note all of those graveyard effects like Crucible of Worlds and Ramunap Excavator are going to allow us to play that more than 1 time in a game. All right, next lands going in, we have the last 3, and these are the Snow Dual lands from Kaldheim. All 3 of the appropriate lands are here. We got the Golgari one with Woodland Chasm, we have the Rakdos one with Sulphurous Mire, and then we have the Gruul one with Highland Forest. They do come into play tapped. They tap for 1 of 2 different colors. Losing tempo by including these lands is not going to be a problem because we have so many ways to ramp up, we'll barely notice that these bad boys come into play tapped. What's most interesting about putting these lands into the 99 goes back to what we were talking about with Nature's Lore and 3 Visits versus Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. Forest card could be a Highland Forest. Forest card could be a Woodland Chasm. So these are fetchable by spells like Nature's Lore, by spells like 3 Visits, and our other fetch lands that were included in this build. So those 5 lands are going into this deck, and they are going to replace these 5 lands. So they're going to replace, the first one is going to be Field of Ruin. This finally came down to being more about not allowing my opponents to get their own basics into play. I got to the point where this was included just for the purposes, not so much for land destruction, but this was included primarily as a way in which to get another land onto our side of the battlefield if we needed it to trigger some of our landfall abilities. But what ends up happening is by activating Field of Ruin, we're putting a basic land on every opponent's side of the battlefield, in addition to one of ours. I don't want to do that. Not anymore. There are enough options, specifically because now that we're including Chaos Warp, If there is a land that's giving us trouble, I would rather just cast a spell to get rid of it as opposed to rewarding every single player at the table with a free basic land. So getting rid of Field of Ruin just makes a lot of sense for the purposes of not trying to advance our opponent's board states. The next land that's going to be replaced is Heart of Yavimaya. When this comes into play, we have to sacrifice a forest, or we sacrifice Heart of Yavimaya. We can tap for a green mana, and we can tap this to give target creature +1/+1 until end of turn. Originally, this land was inserted into the 99 because it was a way in which to get a land into the graveyard, either the heart by itself or the sacrificed forest. Then that way, because of the cards that we have like Crucible of Worlds and Ramunap Excavator, we can play that sacrificed land from our graveyard, which helps to ensure that we don't miss any land drops during our turns. Well, we're getting to the point now where lands like this are becoming obsolete, as in we have better options of getting lands into our battlefield and reusing them, specific to Prismatic Vista. Prismatic Vista is going to do so much more in this deck than Heart of Yavimaya that it makes it almost the easiest choice to take out now that a copy of the Vista has become available. And then for the 3 dual snowlands, we're just going to take out 1 basic of each. There's a mountain, a forest, and a swamp, and that doesn't really hurt with color fixing at all. If anything, it's going to help to solidify the mana base and make this deck even stronger than it was before. And this just echoes a statement I made earlier. As this deck continues to evolve, the mana base is going to become a lot tighter, it's going to be a lot more mainstreamed, and it's going to get to the point where the basic lands in this deck are going to become so sparsely populated that there may just be 1 of each kind. Maybe. We'll see what happens. We got 1 each of those, and then 1 each of the snow-covered. We're going to have to see what happens. Lord Windgrace, not Lord of Windgrace. Lord Windgrace, we'll see what happens in the future. All right, there you have it, MTG BC. We turned over about 1/6 of our Lord Windgrace Jund Lands Matter deck. Let me know your thoughts about these changes in the comment section below. Also, be sure to be on the lookout sometime in the future as Lord Windgrace makes his triumphant entrance into the Burgeoning Commander Catalog. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.